Santa's Game. Every year, as December 24th approaches, I brace myself for the annual visit from Santa. It's not the jolly old man you see in the malls. This Santa is a harbinger of dread, bringing with him a game that has twisted and terrorized my Christmases for years. Every year, I play along, desperately hoping this will be the last. All I want for Christmas this year is to stop playing. It all began when I was a child. I was 8 years old, and my parents were away for the holidays. I was alone in the house when the doorbell rang. Standing there was Santa Claus, not a mall costume but the real deal, complete with a red suit, white beard, and an unsettlingly cold demeanor. He handed me a box wrapped in festive paper and said, "Let's play a game." The box contained an old, ornate chess set. The pieces were intricately carved, and the board had a dark, sinister quality to it. Santa explained the rules: win the game, and I'd get a special gift. Lose, and there would be consequences. At first, it seemed like a harmless game. But as the game progressed, I realized something was terribly wrong. Each move I made seemed to affect my reality. The room grew colder, shadows stretched unnaturally, and the stakes were higher than I could have imagined. With each lost piece, I felt a sense of dread creep closer. The chess pieces on the board took on a life of their own, and I could sense their malicious intent. Somehow, I won that first game. Santa smiled, though it was more of a grimace. He left with a promise that we'd play again next year. The gift he left was no ordinary toy, it was a cursed trinket that seemed to mock my victory. And so, every year, Santa returned with a new game, each more twisted and terrifying than the last. There was the Christmas scavenger hunt, where finding each item meant confronting my deepest fears, and Santa's maze, where the walls seemed to shift, leading me deeper into a labyrinth of terror. The stakes always felt too real, the consequences too severe. Last year's game was the worst. Santa arrived with a game of truth or dare, but the dares were horrific and the truths revealed unspeakable things. The consequences were immediate and nightmarish. Every failed dare seemed to come to life, tormenting me in my own home. This year, I was determined to end it. When the doorbell rang on Christmas Eve, I was ready. I had planned to refuse the game, to confront Santa, and to demand that he leave me alone. But when I opened the door, there he was, just as imposing and unnervingly calm as ever. "Hello again," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Are you ready to play?" I steeled myself and said, "I want this to end. No more games." Santa's eyes, cold and hollow, narrowed. He stepped inside, and the temperature dropped noticeably. "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way. The game must be played." He produced a new game, an old, dusty board with a single piece on it. It was called The Final Move. The instructions were simple but chilling. Make the final move to win the game. Lose, and face the ultimate consequence. I hesitated but knew I had no choice. I had to play. The game started, and I could feel the oppressive weight of Santa's presence in the room. Each move I made seemed to drag me deeper into a sense of dread. I noticed that Santa wasn't just watching, he was participating, subtly manipulating the game's outcome. As the game progressed, the stakes became increasingly clear. Every wrong move brought forth visions of past players who had lost, haunted by their own failures and fears, trapped in a cycle of torment. The board seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though it was feeding off my growing terror. It was then that I realized the true nature of Santa's games. They were more than just twisted pastimes, they were a way to control and torment those who played. Each game fed into his power, drawing strength from the suffering of those he ensnared. The final move was not just a game-ending gesture, it was a decision that could determine the fate of all those who had ever played. Desperation fueled my movements as I made the final move. The room was filled with a blinding light, and for a moment, I thought I had won. But then Santa's voice echoed through the darkness. The game is never truly over. You've played your part, but the cycle continues. The light faded, and I found myself alone, the board and Santa gone. My home was eerily quiet, but a new, dark presence lingered. I knew that I was now part of the game, and Santa's influence would forever be a part of me. The next Christmas, I'll be ready for him. If you receive a visit from Santa that doesn't seem right, don't open the door. Don't play the game. Once you're drawn in, there's no escaping it. All I want for Christmas is to stop playing, but I've learned the hard way that Santa's games are far from over. They never truly end. It's been a year since my last update, and I wish I could say things have improved. But if anything, they've only gotten worse. As I sit here typing this, I'm filled with an overwhelming sense of dread and guilt that I can't shake. I've come to accept that there is no escaping the game, no matter how hard I try. Last Christmas, Santa arrived once more, as he always does, bringing with him a game that I hoped would be different. But I should have known better. The game he presented was the darkest, most horrifying yet, and its consequences were unimaginable. The game was called The Choice, and the rules were simple but chilling. Choose one. One life, one soul. Make your decision. Inside the box was a single, old-fashioned scale with 2 platforms. On each platform was a photograph, one of my father and one of my mother. Santa explained that I had to balance the scale by choosing which photograph would remain on the scale and which would be taken away. The game was more than just a test of choice, it was a macabre dance with fate. I had to decide which of my parents would be sacrificed and which would be spared. The scale was rigged, and no matter how I tried to avoid it, the consequences would be dire. I was paralyzed with fear. How could I make such a decision? The weight of the choice was unbearable, and Santa's cold, unfeeling eyes watched me with a cruel anticipation. I tried to reason with him, to plead for another way, but he was unmoved. The choice had to be made. With trembling hands, I placed my father's photograph on one side of the scale and my mother's on the other. As soon as I made my decision, the scale tipped violently. I could see my father's photograph sinking into a dark abyss, while my mother's rose higher, bathed in an eerie, spectral light. Santa smiled, a smile devoid of warmth or kindness. "It's done," he said. "The game is over." I was left alone, the game and Santa gone. The room felt colder, emptier, as though a piece of my soul had been taken along with the decision I made. The next day, my father was found dead, his passing shrouded in unexplained circumstances. My mother, though still alive, was left broken and grieving. The guilt I feel is unbearable. Every day, I see my father's face in my dreams, hear his voice in the silence, and relive the horror of that Christmas Eve. My mother's suffering is a constant reminder of the price I paid for the twisted game that Santa forced upon me. If you're reading this, know that there is no escaping the game once you're part of it. Every year, Santa will return with a new test, a new torment, and no matter how much you want to end it, the cycle continues. I wish I could tell you that there's hope, that you can find a way out. But I've learned that Santa's games are designed to trap you forever, feeding off your fear, your guilt, and your despair. All I wanted was for the games to end, but now I realize the horrifying truth: once you're caught in Santa's web, there is no escape. So, if you ever find yourself facing Santa's game, don't make the mistake I did. Don't play. The consequences are far worse than you can imagine. And remember, there's no escaping the game. It will follow you, consume you, and haunt you for the rest of your life. Final note, the final countdown. As I write this, I know I only have a few more hours left before the clock strikes midnight on December 23rd. By then, I won't be in this world any longer. I'm about to make the final decision that will end my torment. I'm using these last moments to record every memory I can, every cherished moment, every happy laugh, every warm embrace. I need to remember it all clearly before I'm gone, to hold on to the pieces of my life that brought me joy amid the darkness. If you're reading this, please be wary. The horrors I've faced are beyond anything I could have imagined, and the games I've been forced to play are more than just tests. They are manipulative, cruel, and unrelenting. Here's what you need to know. Stay alert. If you receive an unusual visit or are asked to play a game that doesn't feel right, do not engage. The consequences of these games are far-reaching and devastating. Reach out. If you find yourself in a similar situation, seek help immediately. Talk to someone you trust, contact authorities, or reach out to a mental health professional. Don't face it alone. Value your life. Your life is invaluable. The choices you make are important, and there are always other ways out of difficult situations. Avoid the darkness. If something seems off, trust your instincts. Do not get involved in anything that feels manipulative or harmful, no matter how convincing it may seem. I hope my final note serves as a warning and a guide to help others avoid the suffering I've endured. I've tried to fight back, but the darkness always wins in the end. If you see this and find yourself facing similar horrors, remember that there are ways to seek help and protect yourself. As the final hour approaches, I cling to the hope that my sacrifice might offer some form of protection to others, that my story might prevent another soul from falling into the same trap. Goodbye, and may you be ever vigilant. Stay strong, stay safe, and most importantly, stay away from the games that bring only despair. Story 2. I'm a 32-year-old man with a wife and a young child. My life has been relatively ordinary until the day I made a choice that would unravel everything I thought I knew about reality. I should have known better, but my curiosity got the better of me. It started with a seemingly harmless decision. I bought a mirror. It was an antique mirror, old and ornate, with a dark wood frame carved into intricate patterns. The seller described it as a piece of history, something with character. He was evasive when I asked why he was parting with it, but the price was too tempting to pass up. I imagined it adding a touch of elegance to our living room. Little did I know, it was more than just a decorative piece. It was a conduit to something far more sinister. The first few days after bringing the mirror home were uneventful. It seemed like just another object in the room. However, as time went on, I began to notice odd things. Shadows seemed to linger longer in its reflection, and sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something moving in the mirror, something that wasn't there when I looked directly at it. My wife, Sarah, dismissed it as my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then, one evening, while our child, Emma, was asleep, I saw it, a figure in the mirror that wasn't in the room. The figure was a dark silhouette, its features obscured, but it was unmistakably a presence, something that wasn't part of the room. I blinked and it was gone, but the unease remained. That night, I had trouble sleeping, and every time I closed my eyes, I felt as though I was being watched. The next morning, I told Sarah about it. She was skeptical but agreed that we should keep an eye on it. I didn't want to alarm her or make her think I was losing my grip on reality. Things took a turn for the worse when Emma started acting strangely. She would stare at the mirror, talking to someone or something I couldn't see. When I asked her about it, she would simply say, "The man in the mirror says hello." Her sleep patterns became erratic, and she began to have nightmares. Sarah and I were concerned, but neither of us wanted to admit that the mirror might be the cause. It was ridiculous, right? A haunted mirror? Yet the evidence was mounting, and it was becoming harder to ignore. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard Sarah talking in her sleep. I tried to wake her, but she was unresponsive, her voice a haunting whisper. I looked at the mirror and saw her reflection standing in front of it, even though she was still lying in bed beside me. The reflection's eyes were dark and hollow, and it seemed to be mouthing words I couldn't hear. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. When Sarah finally woke up, she was disoriented and terrified, recounting dreams of being trapped in a dark place, with someone, or something, trying to drag her down. I didn't tell her about what I'd seen, fearing it would only worsen her distress. The following night, I decided to confront whatever was in the mirror. I stood in front of it, demanding it show itself. I felt a cold, malevolent presence behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The temperature in the room dropped, and a heavy silence filled the air. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, and I saw dark, distorted figures moving within it. Desperate and scared, I attempted to cover the mirror with a sheet, but it was as though it resisted. The sheet wouldn't stay on, and I could see the dark figures pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. My hands trembled as I fought to keep the cover in place. The mirror's influence started affecting our family life. Sarah and I began arguing more frequently, our patience with Emma's night terrors wearing thin. We tried to ignore the mirror, but it felt like an oppressive force that was tearing us apart from the inside. The nightmares grew more vivid, and the mirror seemed to feed off our fear and anger. One night, I woke to find Emma standing in front of the mirror, staring at it with an expression of pure terror. I rushed to her, but she didn't respond, her gaze fixed on something in the mirror that I couldn't see. When I tried to pull her away, the mirror seemed to resist, as if it had a grip on her. I knew I had to get rid of the mirror, but it was proving impossible. I tried to dispose of it, but every time I attempted to move it, it felt like an unseen force was holding it back. In desperation, I broke the mirror into pieces, hoping that destroying it would end the nightmare. But as I smashed it, the room filled with a deafening roar, and the shattered glass seemed to swirl with dark energy. Since that night, the atmosphere in the house has shifted. The mirror is gone, but the sense of dread lingers. Emma's nightmares have lessened, but Sarah and I are still haunted by the experiences. The fear remains, and sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see something in the reflections of other mirrors. I regret ever bringing that mirror into our home. What I thought was a simple purchase turned out to be a doorway to something far more sinister. I'm sharing this story not just as a warning but as a plea for understanding. If you ever come across an antique mirror or any object with a history of misfortune, resist the urge to bring it into your life. Now, the shadows of our past experiences seem to follow us, a constant reminder of the dark presence we invited into our lives. The mirror may be gone, but its effects linger, and I fear that our family will never fully escape its grasp. Story 3. The brochure for the Midnight Menagerie boasted it as a unique experience, an exclusive zoo dedicated to the world's most enigmatic and eerie entities. It promised encounters with ghosts, spectral creatures, and entities from beyond the veil. Intrigued by the allure of the supernatural, I decided to visit. The zoo was located on the outskirts of town, hidden deep within a dense, ancient forest. As I arrived, a shiver of unease ran down my spine. The entrance was flanked by wrought iron gates adorned with twisted, unsettling carvings. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and an unsettling fog clung to the ground. Inside, the zoo was unlike any other. The paths were dimly lit by lanterns that cast eerie shadows, and the exhibits were enclosed in ghostly, transparent barriers. Each enclosure was a haunting spectacle, a mix of ethereal beauty and chilling dread. The first exhibit featured a spectral carousel, its ghostly horses frozen in mid-gallop. The air was filled with the faint, melancholic strains of a music box tune, and I could see shadowy figures dancing around it. They seemed to reach out, their hollow eyes watching me with a mournful gaze. As I continued, I came upon an enclosure shrouded in darkness. Within, the form of a monstrous entity with glowing red eyes prowled, its massive shape shifting and undulating like a living shadow. It let out a guttural roar that reverberated through my bones, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The next exhibit was even more unsettling. It housed a collection of eerie apparitions, each trapped in a distorted, spectral cage. They reached out with ghostly hands, their faces twisted in silent screams. I could hear faint whispers and pleas for help as I walked by, the air growing colder with each step. But the most horrifying part of the zoo was yet to come. I reached an area marked with a foreboding sign, the realm of lost souls. The enclosure was a vast, shadowy expanse, and I felt a deep sense of foreboding as I entered. In the center of the enclosure stood an enormous, ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Around the tree were numerous ghostly figures, their eyes hollow and empty. They floated aimlessly, their forms flickering in and out of existence. Some seemed to be reaching for something, while others appeared to be lost in a perpetual state of despair. As I watched, a low, mournful wail filled the air. The spirits began to converge on the tree, their spectral forms merging into a single, writhing mass. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as the mass coalesced into a towering, shadowy figure, an entity of unimaginable power and malice. The entity's eyes glowed with a malevolent fire, and its gaze seemed to pierce through me. It let out a bone-chilling roar that echoed through the enclosure, causing the ghosts to scatter in terror. I could feel its rage and sorrow as it reached out towards me, its presence suffocating and oppressive. In a panic, I turned to flee, but the paths seemed to twist and warp, leading me in circles. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and the whispers grew louder, filled with warnings and pleas. The entity's roar grew closer, and I could feel its cold breath on my neck. Just as I thought I would be engulfed by the darkness, I stumbled upon a hidden exit. I pushed through it, emerging into the night, my heart racing and my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, I could hear the distant, mournful cries of the lost souls and the growls of the entity. I fled the zoo, never looking back. The Midnight Menagerie was a place of unimaginable terror, a realm where the boundary between the living and the dead was blurred. The experience left me forever haunted, a reminder of the dark forces that lurk just beyond our understanding. Update. The Midnight Menagerie vanished without a trace, as if it had never existed at all. After my harrowing visit, I returned to the site, hoping to uncover more about the zoo and perhaps find some clue as to what had happened. To my shock, the place where it once stood was now an empty field, overgrown with weeds and tangled vines. The iron gates were gone, and there was no sign that the zoo had ever been there. Local records showed no mention of the zoo's existence, as if it had been erased from history. No one I spoke to remembered it, and the forest surrounding the area seemed to have swallowed the place whole. It was as if the Midnight Menagerie had been a fleeting nightmare that had slipped from reality. The only remnants of the zoo were the lingering nightmares that haunted my sleep and the occasional chilling whispers that seemed to echo through the darkness. The memories of that night, the spectral entities, and the malevolent presence of the entity remained vivid, a constant reminder of the horrors I had encountered. I often wonder if the zoo's disappearance was a part of some greater cosmic plan, a way for the entities to hide away from the world. Whatever the reason, the Midnight Menagerie was gone, leaving behind only a sense of dread and unanswered questions. The experience taught me that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some places are best left forgotten. The Midnight Menagerie may have vanished, but its dark legacy continues to haunt those who dared to glimpse beyond the veil.